heard her before I saw her, the wet drag of bone or metal along the sleepers, keeping pace with our carriage though we had no steam. Frost glazed the inside of the window, yet a breath like summer rot crept under the door. The telegraph wires above sang without wind. When I pressed my ear to the timber, something below scraped upward, patient, and laughed without lungs. Men have pressed me, in mess rooms and smoking compartments, to set this down as I recall it. I oblige at last, though I question whether any man is the better for such knowledge. If you would hear more of such journeys, you may encourage these recollections and leave your own tales and doubts where I might one day read them. To understand that night upon the line outside Sapporo, I must return to the spring of 1911, when the Ministry of Railways engaged our small party to survey accident sites along the Hokkaido trunk routes. I was then 30 years of age, recently seconded from the Civil Works Office in Tokyo, proud of my instruments and my skepticism. Steel, timber, and calculation seemed to me the only spirits that ruled a railway. There had been, over the preceding 3 years, a troubling sequence of fatalities along the northern lines, many of them involving persons struck and severed upon or near the tracks. The official memoranda spoke of increased traffic, of snowdrifts, of drink. Unofficially, in the tea houses and the third-class carriages, another explanation circulated. One I dismissed as peasant superstition. A woman cut in half by a passing train who now hunted the living along the rails. Our task was simple in its statement and complex in its execution. We were to travel from Otaru eastward, visiting the worst of the accident sites, mapping gradients, measuring visibility, and recommending improvements. I was placed in charge of the surveying work. With me were 3 men whose faces remain as clear to me now as the day we first shook hands on the platform. There was Henderson, an English engineer retained as a foreign consultant, tall and spare, with a manner at once sardonic and kindly. Years upon Indian and African lines had left his skin darkened and his lungs lined with tobacco. He affected a certain disdain for local superstition, yet he treated the Japanese staff with a courtesy that many of his countrymen lacked. Nakajima, our interpreter and liaison with the local stations, was a Sapporo man of about my own age. Slight and quick, with a habit of pushing his spectacles up his nose whenever he grew nervous. He had studied in Tokyo and prided himself on his modern outlook, though I later learned that his grandmother had been a shrine attendant. Lastly, there was young Ito, barely 20, a chainman and assistant surveyor, whose hands were calloused from farm work and whose eyes held that mixture of eagerness and apprehension I had once seen in my own reflection. He carried our tools with reverence: the brass-bound theodolite, the leveling staff, the measuring chains, the notebooks wrapped in oiled cloth. We departed Otaru on the morning of 12th April 1911, our baggage stacked in the corner of a second-class compartment. Canvas rolls, tripods, a battered field chest containing my maps, a kerosene lantern, and a portable telegraph set for emergencies. Outside, the last of the winter snow lay in dirty ridges along the sidings, and the sea beyond the yard was the color of hammered lead. The first days passed in professional routine. We would descend at some minor station, take tea in the stationmaster's cramped office, and then walk out along the line to the marked site of a prior accident. There we paced distances, sketched embankments, and argued over sight lines, while freight trains clanked past and the cold wind off the fields tugged at our coats. At the first sight, near Tain, the ballast still bore a darker stain where a labourer had fallen beneath a night train during a storm the previous year. The stationmaster, a broad man with a red nose, swore that the fellow had been drunk. Henderson agreed at once, tapping ash from his pipe onto the rails. "Men and locomotives do not mix," he observed. "That is all the ghost you require." Ito, who had been staring at the stained stones, looked up and forced a laugh. "Yes, sir, ghosts of rice wine. I recall that we shared a cigarette there, the four of us standing between the rails while the telegraph wires sang overhead." Ito spoke of his village in the hills west of Sapporo, of his mother's hope that he would one day become a station master himself. Nakajima told us of his young wife, expecting their first child in the summer, and asked me, somewhat shyly, whether Tokyo was truly as crowded as the prince suggested. I answered as best I could, describing the jostle of Ginza on a festival day, the smell of chestnuts and coal smoke, the way the electric lamps made the river look like a strip of molten brass. For a moment, the four of us stood not as surveyors and consultants, but as men imagining futures, promotions, children, comfort. Had I known how short some of those futures would be, I might have spoken differently. The first oddity we encountered, I attributed to carelessness. At a small cutting east of Sapporo, where a girl of 14 had been killed the previous autumn, we found the warning board that should have stood upright by the track lying face down in the ditch. The post had not rotted. It had been snapped cleanly at a height of perhaps half a metre. "Vandals," I said, running my fingers along the splintered grain. "Or a cart." "There is no cart road here," Nakajima replied quietly. He was looking not at the board, but at the rails themselves. A smear of something brownish-black ran along the inside of the left-hand rail for nearly 2 meters, as if something soft had been dragged there. It was not rust. Ito swallowed. "Perhaps a deer." Henderson grunted. "Then it was a deer that bled like a man. Come, let us measure the curve." We set to work, and in the industry of angles and chains my unease ebbed. The wind in the cutting had a peculiar quality, though, a faint whistling that did not match the visible movement of the grasses. Several times I glanced up, thinking I heard the click of metal on metal somewhere out of sight, but each time there was nothing, only the long perspective of the line, vanishing into a pale distance. That night, we slept in the upper room of a wayside inn near the tracks. The proprietress, a stooped woman with hair more white than black, served us hot rice and pickled vegetables and watched us eat with an intent expression. When she learned our purpose, she set her jaw and muttered something under her breath that I did not catch. Nakajima coloured and translated only part of it. "She says we should be careful, that the line has memories." Henderson laughed and raised his cup. "So do we all, madam. I assure you, we are not afraid of stories." The woman's gaze lingered on Ito, then on me. "Stories are afraid of you," she said in a low voice, "because you write them down." That remark disturbed me more than I cared to admit. I lay awake for some time after the others had begun to snore, listening to the distant passage of trains. The sound was muffled by distance and timber, yet at one point I heard, or believed I heard, a second rhythm beneath the wheels, a rapid, irregular tapping as of metal striking wood in quick succession, keeping pace with the locomotive. I told myself that it was some defect in the rails or a loose coupling. Eventually, I slept. In the days that followed, such small disquietudes accumulated. At one site, we found the remains of a lantern, its glass shattered outward rather than inward, as if something had burst from within. At another, a farm dog that had trotted alongside us for an hour suddenly stopped at a culvert, whined, and refused to cross the tracks, though its master called and cursed. The local stationmasters grew less forthcoming the further east we travelled. Some spoke freely of snowdrifts, of men misjudging distances in fog. Others, when pressed about the manner of certain injuries, fell silent and glanced toward the line as if afraid of being overheard. It was at a small station near the outskirts of Sapporo that I first heard the name given to the thing that haunted those rails. We had retired to the office to examine the accident ledger, a thick volume whose pages smelled of ink and mildew. Henderson and I bent over the entries while Ito warmed his hands at the small iron stove. "Here," I said, tapping a line dated November of the previous year. "Female, approximately 20 years of age, struck by freight number 42 at kilometer post 17. Fatal injuries to lower extremities. That is the girl from the cutting." The station master, a nervous man with a sparse moustache, nodded. "Yes, she fell from the platform, they said." "They said?" Henderson raised an eyebrow. The man hesitated, then leaned forward. "Her upper body was found on the platform near the telegraph pole. Her lower body was upon the track some distance away. The driver swore he had seen no one until he felt the wheels jump." Ito made a small sound in his throat. I frowned. "A shunting accident, perhaps. The body moved after death." "Perhaps," the station master agreed, though his eyes did not. Yet, in the weeks after, the night men heard sounds. Something moving along the line when no train was due. A scraping. A hopping. He swallowed. They began to call it Teke Teke from the sound. He pronounced it with a soft click of the tongue. Teke, Teke, like metal striking sleepers in quick succession. "Children's tales," I said, more sharply than was necessary. "A grief given legs." The station master's gaze slid to the window, where the telegraph wire hummed in a wind we could not feel. "Grief has legs," he murmured. "And hands." We left soon after. Henderson, as we walked back to the platform, blew out a cloud of smoke and said, "Every country has its railway ghosts. There is a woman in white on the Great Western, a headless porter near Madras. They spring up where men die quickly and without sense. I would not trouble yourself over it." "And yet you know their stories," I replied. He smiled thinly. "I am an engineer, not a priest. I catalogue defects, that is all." By then, I had begun to notice another pattern. At several of the more recent accident sites, the injuries described in the ledgers shared a curious similarity. Bodies severed cleanly at or near the waist, as if laid upon some invisible anvil. In each case, the official explanation involved a fall from a platform or a misjudged crossing. In each case, there were whispers of other things. At one rural halt, where a farmer returning from market had been found in 2 pieces beside his cart, the station porter refused to walk with us to the post that marked the spot. He remained by the station door, hat in hand, and called after us. "Do not linger there after the sun goes down. She is angry with men who stand where she cannot." "What does he mean by that?" I asked Nakajima. He adjusted his spectacles and avoided my eye. "There is a story that the woman who was cut by the train was left to die because no one wished to touch her, to stain themselves with her blood. They say she drags herself now, seeking the legs she lost, or the men who watched. I snorted. Then she will be disappointed. We have no legs to spare. Ito did not laugh. He was staring down the line, where the rails converged on a horizon blurred by low cloud. If she has no legs, he said quietly, how does she move so quickly that men hear her at their window and have no time to close it? That night, in the small lodging house attached to the station, I dreamed of the line as a great black thread laid across the island, pulsing faintly like a vein. Something moved along it, not atop the sleepers, but in the narrow darkness between the ballast stones, a pale shape that flowed like water and struck like iron. I woke with my heart hammering and the taste of cold iron on my tongue. For all that, my rational mind held its ground. I told myself that we were dealing with a cluster of unfortunate accidents, nothing more. The human mind, confronted with senseless loss, sought pattern and agency. Give it a name, a sound, a woman's face, and grief became a story one could tell by the stove. It was perhaps 10 days into our work when the first incident occurred that I cannot, even now, fold neatly into any known category. We had taken a small inspection handcar from Sapporo to examine a stretch of line that ran through marshy ground, where mist gathered in the evenings and the rails sweated with condensation. The weather that day was clear but cold. The sky a hard blue dome. We pushed the handcar ourselves, taking turns at the lever, our breath steaming. Henderson hummed some English tune under his breath. The rhythm of the wheels upon the joints of the rails became a kind of heartbeat. Clack, 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 clack. The telegraph poles marched past like sentries. At kilometre post 16, where a minor derailment had occurred the previous winter, we dismounted to examine the embankment. Ito and I took the chains and staff to measure the gradient, while Henderson remained by the handcar to note the condition of the sleepers. Nakajima walked a little way ahead, recording the distances to a signal and a culvert. The marsh lay flat and silent on either side of the line, broken only by the occasional tuft of dead grass. No birds called. Even the usual faint hum of insects was absent. I remember remarking on this to Ito. He shrugged, but his eyes were uneasy. We had been working perhaps 20 minutes when I heard it, a faint, irregular tapping, somewhere behind us along the line. Teke Teke, faster than any man could walk, slower than a train. I straightened and looked back. The rails stretched empty in both directions, gleaming in the pale light. "Do you hear that?" I called to Henderson. He had heard it. I could tell by the way he had frozen, pipe halfway to his mouth. The sound grew louder, resolving itself into two distinct components, a hard clack like metal on wood and a softer scrape as of something dragging. Teke, Teke, shh. "There is no train due," Nakajima said. His voice was tight. I checked the timetable myself. We stood upon the ballast, listening. The sound seemed to come from just beyond the next slight curve, perhaps 100 meters away. I felt the faintest tremor through the soles of my boots, as if something heavy but not massive was striking the sleepers in quick succession. "A handcar," Ito suggested. "Another inspection party." "Perhaps," I said. "Stand clear of the line in any case." We stepped down onto the cinder verge. The tapping grew louder, nearer. Teke, Teke, shh. My hand went to the pocket where I kept my watch, though I did not draw it out. I remember the hairs rising on my forearms, though the air was no colder than before. Then, as suddenly as if a switch had been thrown, the sound ceased. Not faded, not receded, stopped. The rails before us lay bare and gleaming. The telegraph wire above hung slack. We remained there for some time, straining our ears. There was nothing. No echo, no distant continuation. Slowly, I felt my rational mind reassert itself. Sound carried strangely in such flat country. Perhaps some farmer's cart had crossed a wooden bridge half a mile away. Perhaps ice had shifted in a culvert. Henderson cleared his throat and forced a laugh. "There, your Teke Teke has missed its appointment. Let us finish before the light fails." We returned to our measurements, but the ease of earlier days had gone. Ito flinched at every small noise. Nakajima kept glancing back along the line, as if expecting to see some figure appear upon it. When at last we pushed the handcar back towards Sapporo, we did so with more haste than was strictly necessary. It was that same evening that the midsection shock, if I may call it so, occurred. We had returned to the small siding where we were lodging, a cluster of timber buildings beside the line. The stationmaster had gone home. We had the office to ourselves. Henderson sat at the desk, pen scratching as he compiled his notes. Ito dozed on a bench, cap over his eyes. I was at the telegraph table, sending a brief report to the district office in Sapporo. The tapper clicked beneath my fingers, spelling out our mundane observations. Gradient acceptable, visibility fair. Recommend additional signage. The line crackled faintly with static. In the midst of this, the sounder at my elbow sprang to life with a sudden fury. The armature hammered against its stop faster than any operator could have keyed. The pattern was meaningless, a rapid stuttering that set my teeth on edge. It was as if some vast insect were trapped within the box, beating itself against the wooden lid. "Who is on the line?" I called, raising my voice over the din. "Is that Sapporo?" There was no answer, only that frantic, senseless rattling. Ito jerked awake, eyes wide. Henderson rose slowly to his feet, his chair scraping the floor. Nakajima, who had been washing his hands in the corner basin, turned, water dripping from his fingers. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the sound stopped. The sounder arm hung motionless. The room seemed suddenly very quiet. I felt a pressure in my ears, as though we had ascended a mountain too quickly. I reached out and touched the metal of the instrument. It was warm, almost hot. The faint smell of ozone hung in the air. "Perhaps a short in the wire," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. Henderson stepped closer, peering at the device. "In all my years," he murmured, "I have never heard a line speak such nonsense. Morse has its rhythms, even when a man is drunk. That was something else." Nakajima bent over the paper strip, where the inking pen had traced a jagged, continuous line during the outburst. "No letters," he said. "No breaks. Only this." Ito, from the doorway, whispered, "It sounded like Teke Teke." We laughed at that because the alternative was to consider it seriously. Yet, when I lay in my narrow bunk that night, I could not rid myself of the impression that something had attempted to speak along the wire and failed, or had not cared whether we understood. From that point onward, the rational explanations I had so carefully marshalled began to fray. We still performed our duties, still measured and sketched, but I felt as if we were walking along the edge of some unseen current that might at any moment surge up and take us. The culmination came, as such things often do, on a night that began in utter mundanity. We had been ordered to inspect a newly completed siding and signal arrangement east of Sapporo, where freight trains were to be shunted to allow the passage of express services. The work had been finished in haste, and there were concerns about the interlocking of points and signals. We arrived at the small junction in the late afternoon of 23rd April. The weather had turned. A wet, clinging mist drifted up from the low ground, beading on our coats and on the brass of the theodolite. The junction itself consisted of a modest wooden station building, a water tower, and a fan of sidings that disappeared into the fog. The signal arms loomed like ghostly crosses. The station master, a young man with the strained look of one promoted too quickly, greeted us with palpable relief. "You are welcome," he said, bowing repeatedly. "There have been difficulties, misreadings, men hearing bells that do not ring, seeing arms move when they have not. Defective linkages," Henderson said briskly. "We shall soon put them right." We spent the remaining light examining the levers and rods in the small signal cabin, testing the correspondence between handle and arm. The mechanisms behaved as they should. I began to suspect that the stationmaster's men were simply inexperienced, their nerves frayed by responsibility. By the time we emerged, night had fallen. The mist had thickened into a fine, penetrating drizzle that deadened sound. The lamps along the platform burned within small halos of yellow. Somewhere in the distance, a locomotive whistled, its note muffled. Our plan had been to take the last mixed train back toward Sapporo and sleep at a larger station. However, a telegraphed order arrived as we stood upon the platform, oilskins buttoned to our chins. There had been a minor landslip further east. The line was blocked. No trains would pass until morning. "We can put you in the spare carriage on the siding," the station master said apologetically. "It is dry, at least." We accepted. The spare carriage was an older third-class coach, its wooden benches scarred by years of use. It stood upon a short siding that branched from the main line just beyond the points, its buffers nearly touching the darkness beyond the last lamp. We carried our baggage aboard and lit our own lantern, hanging it from a hook in the ceiling. The mist pressed against the windows, rendering the world outside an indistinct grey. The only sound was the occasional drip of water from the eaves and the faint ticking of the cooling rails. Inside, we attempted a semblance of normality. Henderson produced a small bottle of whiskey from his valise, and we passed it between us, taking modest sips. Ito unwrapped a packet of dried fish from his mother and shared it out. "At least we shall not be run down in our sleep," he said, forcing a smile, "unless your Teke Teke can move carriages." "Do not give her ideas," Nakajima replied. His levity sounded strained. We spoke for some time of inconsequential things, the coming planting season, the rumors of political unrest in Tokyo, the novelty of aeroplanes. Eventually, one by one, we fell silent. Henderson stretched out along a bench, coat over his face. Ito curled on the opposite side of the carriage, cap pulled low. Nakajima and I remained seated upright, backs against the wooden slats, the lantern swaying gently above. I do not know at what hour I first woke. The lantern had burned low, its flame a small sullen knot. The carriage was very cold. My breath smoked in front of my face. For a moment, I could not recall where we were. Then the faint smell of coal smoke and wet timber oriented me. I became aware, as one becomes aware of a ticking clock in a distant room, of a sound beneath the carriage. It was faint, regular, and entirely wrong. Teke, teke, shh. A hard strike, a softer drag, the rhythm of something moving along the sleepers. I held my breath. The sound drew nearer, then paused directly beneath us. The floorboards vibrated ever so slightly, as if under the weight of a body that was not quite heavy enough. I could hear, too, a faint wetness in the sound, a suggestion of something soft impacting wood. Across from me, in the dimness, I saw Nakajima's eyes open. He had heard it as well. His hand crept to his throat, fingers pressing against his skin, as if to assure himself that it remained whole. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. He nodded, the movement barely perceptible. The sound resumed, moving along the length of the carriage toward the far end. "Teke, Teke, shh." It stopped beneath where Ito lay. There was a long silence. I could hear nothing but my own pulse. Then, from beneath the floor, there came a new sound, a slow, deliberate scratching, as of nails or metal upon the underside of the planks. It traced the outline of the bench, then rose, faintly, as if whatever made it were climbing. The lantern flickered, though there was no draught. I found that I could not move. My limbs felt as if they belonged to another man, far away. Only my eyes obeyed me, and they were fixed upon the end of the carriage where the door stood closed. The handle of that door rattled, once, twice, with a jerking impatience. Then it turned slowly, without a hand upon it. The latch lifted with a small metallic click that sounded in the hush like the report of a pistol. The door swung inward a hand's breadth, then wider. No wind entered. The mist outside remained a grey wall. Yet something else came in, something that altered the temperature and the pressure of the air. It was as if a piece of the night itself had detached and slid into the carriage. What I saw then I have described only once before, in a sealed memorandum that never left the ministry's files. Even now I question my own recollection, though the image is burned into me as surely as any scar. She was, in one sense, precisely what the stories had said. A woman from the waist up and no more. Her upper body was that of a young woman in a tattered school uniform, the white blouse stiff with old dark stains, the navy collar askew. Her skin had the pallor of something long kept from the sun. Her hair hung in lank, tangled strands that clung to her cheeks. Where her body ended, just below the ribcage, there was no clean line of amputation such as a surgeon might make. Instead, there was a ruin of torn flesh and splintered bone, as if she had been wrenched apart by forces indifferent to the structure of the human frame. From this mass protruded lengths of what at first I took for intestine, but which, as she moved, struck the floor with a hard metallic clack. They were not viscera. They were shards of bone and twisted metal, fragments of rail and wheel embedded in her, fused to her by some unimaginable violence. She propelled herself upon these, her arms braced, her fingers splayed wide. Each movement drove the metal into the floor with that now familiar tech, followed by the wet drag of her ruined lower body. Her face was the worst of it, not for any monstrous distortion, but for its familiarity. I had seen such a face many times at rural stations, a girl who might have been on her way to school, to market, to a future of small, comprehensible joys. Her eyes, though, held no such future. They were wide and black and empty, like tunnels. She looked first at Ito, who still slept oblivious, her head tilted bird-like. Then her gaze moved, unhurried, to me. For an instant, our eyes met. In that instant, I felt something probe at the edges of my thought, not with words, but with a kind of blind, groping hunger. It was not malice, precisely. It was a need, raw and all-consuming. My throat constricted. I wanted to cry out, to wake the others, to flee. Instead, I sat rigid, as if some invisible hand had pressed me into the bench. She opened her mouth. The sound that emerged was not a scream, nor any word in any language I know. It was a high, thin keening that seemed to come from the rails themselves, a vibration that set the glass in the windows trembling. The lantern flared and nearly went out. Ito woke with a start, his eyes flying open. He saw her. I know he did, for his face changed in a way I have seen only once before, in a man who realized too late that the bridge beneath him was gone. He drew in breath to shout. She moved with a speed that belied her grotesque mode of locomotion. Teke Teke Teke. In the space of that single indrawn breath, she was upon him, her hands at his shoulders, her face inches from his. What happened then I will not describe in detail. There was a blur of movement, a sound like wet cloth tearing, and a spray of warmth across my face that I refused for some seconds to identify. Ito's cry was cut short, as if a wire had been severed. I saw, dimly, his legs still twitching upon the bench, his upper body no longer attached to them. The woman's ruined torso hunched over him, working with a terrible, methodical efficiency. The air filled with the metallic stink of blood, and something else, something like hot iron. Henderson lurched to his feet, swearing in English. He snatched at his valise, fumbling for the revolver I knew he kept there. Nakajima made a strangled sound and pressed himself against the wall, his spectacles askew. The woman's head snapped up. Her face was slick with red. She turned toward Henderson, who had at last closed his fingers around the pistol. Their eyes met. For a moment, I thought he might fire. Instead, his hand spasmed, and the weapon slipped from his grasp, clattering to the floor. She smiled then. It was a small, almost shy movement, utterly at odds with the carnage that surrounded her. Then she was gone, not in any puff of smoke or theatrical vanishing, but with a series of rapid, retreating impacts. Teke Teke Teke. Out the door, down the steps, beneath the carriage. The door swung shut behind her with a soft click. Silence crashed down upon us. The lantern guttered, then steadied. For several seconds, none of us moved. Then Henderson staggered forward and fell to his knees beside what remained of Ito. "God," he whispered. "Oh, God." Nakajima began to retch, his body convulsing. I sat where I was, my hands gripping the edge of the bench so tightly that my knuckles ached. Some detached part of my mind noted the pattern of blood spatter on the opposite wall, the way it thinned toward the ceiling. The immediate aftermath passed in a kind of numb, mechanical flurry. We shouted for the stationmaster, our voices breaking. Men came running with lanterns, their faces pale in the yellow light. Someone screamed when they saw the interior of the carriage. Someone else crossed himself, though that was not his faith. We wrapped what we could of Ito in a blanket, though there was no dignity to be salvaged. Henderson, his hands and sleeves stained, moved with the slow precision of a man repairing a broken machine, as if by arranging the parts he might restore function. Nakajima sat on the platform edge, staring at his hands as if they belonged to a stranger. There was talk, at first, of some intruder, some madman with a blade. Yet there were no footprints in the damp cinders outside the carriage, save our own. The mist had thickened, but it could not have erased them so completely in so short a time. The blood that had soaked into the floorboards had no corresponding trail upon the steps. It was as if the violence had begun and ended within that small wooden box, with no path in or out. Dawn came grey and listless. A telegraph was sent to Sapporo. Fatal accident. Details to follow. We were questioned by the stationmaster, by a district inspector who arrived on the first available train, his collar askew, his eyes red from lack of sleep. "What did you see?" he asked me, pen poised. I looked at the blank page, at the expectant faces, at the sheet-draped shape on the platform. I saw again the woman's eyes, the embedded metal, the way she had moved. "A man," I said, my voice sounding flat to my own ears. "A man with a blade. He must have boarded the carriage after we slept." I woke to a struggle. It was over very quickly. In the confusion, I did not see his face. The inspector frowned. "And how did he leave?" "I do not know," I said. "Perhaps he jumped from the carriage while we raised the alarm." Henderson and Nakajima, when questioned separately, told similar lies. We had not agreed upon them in advance. They emerged from us as if drawn by some common, unspoken current. None of us mentioned the door that had opened without a hand, the sound beneath the floor, the woman with half a body. The official report, compiled over the following days, spoke of a deranged vagrant who had boarded the carriage in the night, attacked Ito with a knife, and fled into the mist. A search of the surrounding fields and ditches was conducted, of course. No such man was found. The case was quietly closed. We returned to Sapporo in a silence that felt heavier than any words. On the train, Henderson sat with his hat in his hands, turning it over and over. At one point, he said, without looking at me, "You saw her, did you not?" "Yes," I replied. "So did I." He paused. "In Africa once, I saw a lion take a man. There was a sense to it, a terrible natural sense. This had none." Nakajima, across the aisle, flinched as the train passed over a set of points, the wheels clattering beneath us. "If we tell them," he said softly, "they will say we are mad, or drunk, or that we killed him ourselves." "We did kill him," Henderson muttered, "by bringing him there." At the Sapporo office, we were received with a solemnity due to men who had lost a colleague in the line of duty. There were condolences, black armbands, the usual phrases about sacrifice and the progress of the nation. Ito's family was informed that he had died defending his comrades from an assailant. A small pension was arranged. I wrote my portion of the official report in the language of gradients and clearances, of human error and unfortunate circumstance. Nowhere did the word tech appear. Nowhere did I mention the embedded metal, the sound along the sleepers. When I had finished, I felt as if I had betrayed not only Ito, but the truth itself. Yet what truth could I have written? That the line itself had given birth to something from the accumulated violence of its accidents. That a woman torn in half by steel and indifference had become a thing that hunted along the rails, seeking company in her mutilation. Such notions had no place in the ministry file. In private, however, I did set down a fuller account. Late one night, in my lodging house in Sapporo, I took out a blank notebook and wrote in a cramped hand everything I have here related, and more besides. I described the woman, the sound, the door. I recorded the exact time, the weather, the position of the carriage upon the siding. I did this not in the hope of convincing others, but to convince myself that it had truly happened. When I returned to Tokyo some weeks later, I placed that notebook in an envelope and addressed it to a senior official in the ministry whom I trusted. I marked it confidential. I never received any acknowledgement. Years later, When I inquired discreetly whether such a document had been logged, I was told that no record of it existed. In the years that followed, I continued my work upon the railways. I married, I had children, lines were built and improved. Accidents, though reduced, did not cease. From time to time, in the margins of reports from the north, I would see certain phrases recur. Body severed at waist, circumstances unclear. Night watchman reports unusual sounds along track. Station staff refused to work certain shifts. Once, in 1917, I received a letter from Nakajima. He had left the railway service and returned to Sapporo to manage a small shop. His wife and child were well, he wrote. He apologized for the long silence and asked, in a single, carefully phrased sentence, whether I had ever heard that sound again. He did not name it. I replied that I had not, though in truth I had, in dreams and in the clatter of distant trains. I asked whether he had remained near the lines. His answer, when it came, was brief. He had moved his family to a house well away from any track, he wrote, because his son woke screaming if a train passed within earshot. He did not say what the boy claimed to see at his window. Henderson. I saw only once more in Yokohama in 1920. He was older, thinner, his hair more grey than brown. We met by chance in a tea house near the harbour, both of us sheltering from a sudden shower. For a time we spoke of neutral matters, the war in Europe, the spread of motor cars, the increasing speed of express services. Then, as the rain drummed upon the roof, he said abruptly, "Do you remember that night near Sapporo?" "I remember," I said. He stared into his cup. "I have laid many miles of track since then. I have seen bridges fail, boilers burst, men crushed. All of it I can file under cause and effect. But that, I have no ledger for that." "Nor I admitted. He gave a short, bitter laugh. "They say now that the future belongs to machines, that if we lay enough steel and string enough wires, there will be no room left for ghosts. I am not so sure. Perhaps we are building them houses." We parted soon after. 2 years later, I learned, in a brief notice in an engineering journal, that he had died of a stroke while inspecting a viaduct in India. The article made no mention of ghosts. As for myself, I have grown older. The lines I helped to survey have carried millions of passengers. Children who were not born when Ito died now ride to school along tracks that pass, unknowing, within a few meters of the siding where his life was cut in two. The nation speaks of progress, of speed, of efficiency. Men in offices draw new routes upon maps with ink that smells faintly of the old ledgers. Yet there are nights, even now, when I lie awake in my Tokyo house and hear, beneath the ordinary rumble of distant trains, a different rhythm. Teke, Teke, shh. It comes not from any particular direction, but from the bones of the city itself, from the web of rails that crisscross beneath streets and rivers. When it comes, the air in my room grows cold, and the hairs upon my arms stand up as they did that night in the carriage. Once, some years ago, I attempted to exercise the memory by investigation. I took leave from my duties and travelled north again, alone, under the pretext of reviewing an old report. I visited the junction where Ito had died. The siding was gone, replaced by a new arrangement of points. The station building had been rebuilt in brick after a fire. No one there remembered the incident. I walked along the line as far as the place where I judged the siding must once have been. The ballast had been renewed, the sleepers replaced. There was no visible trace of blood, of torn timber, of anything out of the ordinary. A freight train passed, its wheels clattering. The driver waved. For a moment, I almost convinced myself that we had imagined it all, that shock and mist and the suggestibility of tired men had woven a nightmare from some more mundane horror. Then, as I stood there, a small boy emerged from behind the station, a stick in his hand. He began to tap it along the sleepers, imitating the sound of a train. "Teke, Teke," he chanted under his breath. "Teke, Teke." I asked him as casually as I could where he had learned that song. He looked up at me with frank curiosity. "Everyone knows it," he said. "It is the sound she makes when she comes for you." "Who?" I asked, though I already knew. He shrugged and ran off, his stick rattling along the rail. I stood there a long time after he had gone, listening to the fading echoes. I have told this story to very few. Once, to my wife, in the early years of our marriage, when some newspaper account of a railway accident in Hokkaido stirred old images. She listened in silence, then took my hand and held it tightly. She did not tell me that I was mad. She did not tell me that ghosts do not exist. She only said, "You came back, some do not." Perhaps that is all that can be said. We laid steel across the land and believed that by doing so, we had tamed distance, harnessed power, bent the world to timetables and gradients. We did not consider what else might travel along those shining paths, what old griefs and sudden deaths might find in them a means of persistence. What disturbs me most after all these years is not the memory of her face, nor even the sound of her movement, but a smaller, more intimate detail. As she paused beneath our carriage that night, before she rose, I heard, very faintly, the soft, irregular tap of fingers upon wood, as if she were feeling her way, searching for the weak point. It was the gesture of a blind person seeking a door. When the house is quiet and the last train has passed, I sometimes feel through the floorboards a similar exploratory touch, far below, where the city's rails hum in the dark. I lie very still, listening, and imagine her there, patient as rust, tracing the lines we have laid, waiting for the moment when some unwary soul will stand where she cannot.